Today I've decided to pwn a creationist, and I found a video called Why Do People Laugh at Evolutionists Part 2. It was a response to Thunderfoot's video Why Do People Laugh at Creationists Part 36. Keep in mind I have a zoology degree and have read many books on evolution. So, here we go.
Moreover, there is no difference between fossils hundreds of millions of years old and their modern descendants. For instance, a 400 million year old shark and a modern shark have exactly the same structure. Similarly,
this doesn't disprove evolution. All it tells us is that there are some taxa that have existed unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Sharks are a good example, as they have been around for at least 400 million years. Scientists know that sharks are among the most primitive of fishes, and so are not surprised to discover that they have lived that long ago. Even today, there are several species of sharks, which shows that there has been at least some evolution among them splitting off from a common ancestor.
there is no difference between a 100 million year old ant and a modern ant, a 135 million year old dragonfly and a modern dragonfly, a 100 million year old turtle and a modern turtle, or a 55 million year old bat and a modern bat. That is, all living kinds were created by God and did not undergo any evolution after their creation.
Again, here are more examples of taxa that would make perfect sense to see in the fossil record. The bat fossil, for instance, is a common ancestor or a relative of a common ancestor to all or most modern bats. Scientists know how long ago ants, turtles, and other creatures have lived, and many taxa are so well adapted that they remain unchanged for millions of years. Just find an example of a fossil that wouldn't make sense, such as a rabbit in the Cambrian layer. The speaker is ignoring the fact that there are many species of each taxa, so there had to have been at least some evolution in order for that variation to take place. He doesn't understand how evolution could have taken place, therefore God did it 6,000 years ago.
One of the most important of these alleged transitional forms was the fossil of a fish called the coelacanth. For years, evolutionists claimed that this creature, which was only known in the fossil record, had characteristics similar to those of land-dwelling animals. It had, they argued, primitive legs and a primitive lung.
Yes, and so did the many other fish to tetrapod transitional forms, such as Acanthostega, Ichthyostega, Tuluperton, Tiktaalik, and others.
These evolutionist claims about the coelacanth were advanced as a scientific fact, and imaginary drawings picturing the animal crawling onto land from water made their way even to textbooks.
He's actually saying that scientists believe tetrapods evolved from the coelacanth. No scientist claims this.
It came as a great shock to evolutionists when a living example of the supposedly extinct coelacanth was caught in the Indian Ocean in 1938. It was then seen that the fish was no different from the fish of our day, contrary to the claims of evolutionists.
This is an outright lie. The fossil coelacanth is an entirely different family than the modern coelacanth latimeria.
Coelacanths had neither legs nor primitive lungs. What was worse, the coelacanth, supposedly a creature readying itself to make the leap from sea to land, was in reality a fish that lived only in the deep waters of the oceans, never approaching to within 180 meters of the surface.
Again, it wasn't the coelacanth that gave rise to modern tetrapods. Even if that were true, it wouldn't be a problem for evolution. It's like saying, if tetrapods came from the coelacanth, why do we still have the coelacanth? It's a very bad argument.
The evolutionist claims about the claw-like nails on the wings of the Archaeopteryx also failed, since similar structures were also discovered in modern birds like the hoatzin.
While it is true that claws are present on the fingers of Archaeopteryx, it's in the adult form. The hoatzin lose the claws by the time they reach adulthood. In fact, almost all birds have claws to some extent, mostly in the embryonic stage, but they are lost after hatching. In retaining a primitive reptilian feature which other birds lose just before leaving the egg, the hoatzin is showing us its reptilian pedigree. Far from being evidence to the contrary, the Hoatzin is additional evidence for the reptilian ancestry of birds.
Because of such reasons, one of the foremost defenders of the theory of evolution, the Harvard paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, had to admit that Archaeopteryx could not be considered as a transitional form.
This is probably among the most famous case of misunderstanding of scientists by creationists. It's obvious that Gould did not specifically exclude Archaeopteryx as a transitional form, but merely as an example of a smooth transitional form. Gould himself was aware that creationists often misquote him. He clarifies his position by saying that transitional forms are generally lacking at the species level, but are abundant between larger groups.
We can see that it is impossible for an evolutionary process to have occurred between them. For instance, it is impossible for fish that have their respiratory systems, excretory systems, muscle structures, and metabolisms completely designed to live in water to have transformed into land-dwelling animals by stepping out of the water.
Just because you don't understand how this transition is possible doesn't mean it is impossible. For instance, fish swim bladders are the analogous structure to tetrapod lungs. Structures that had one function in an ancestor will often have a different function due to changes in lifestyle or niche, such as going from sea to land.
Evolutionists claim that birds evolved from reptiles by random mutations. However, reptiles are cold-blooded, whereas birds are warm-blooded.
He doesn't understand how it's possible that warm-blooded creatures could have cold-blooded ancestors. I'm not sure how this would disprove evolution.
The aerodynamic properties of the bird wings cannot be explained by evolution at all. It is impossible for wings to have gradually developed, as evolutionists claim, because a half-developed wing is not an advantage, but a fatal disadvantage.
It is very possible for evolution to explain bird wings, and he's using the "what good is half a wing" argument. An intermediate stage could have a variety of functions, including, but not limited to, gliding, catching insects, and startling potential predators. The gliding membranes of flying squirrels, for instance, have what may very well be an intermediate pre-flying form.
Evolutionists also claim that some reptiles transformed into mammals. However, these two living groups are also very distinct from each other. Reptiles lay eggs, while mammals give birth to their offspring.
He also doesn't understand how egg-laying can eventually evolve into live birth. In fact, there are some reptiles that give live birth, and some mammals that lay eggs. The group of reptiles that eventually gave rise to mammals were called the synapsids, which are unrelated to any other reptile living today. Intermediate forms between mammal-like reptiles and the first mammals are known, and an outstanding record of the changes in the facial bones between these reptiles and true mammals is also known.
As opposed to the scales of reptiles, the bodies of mammals are covered with fur. The lactation mechanism is peculiar to mammals, and evolutionists can never explain its origin.
Yes, we can actually. Just look at a modern monotreme such as a platypus. They provide clues as to how the first mammals lactated through secretions in their skin. It is highly reasonable that early mammals lactated similarly, and later descendants would eventually evolve mammary glands.
Simply put, Australopithecus, advanced as the ancestor of man by evolutionists, is merely an extinct ape species. On the other hand,
All right.
Oxnard's results were based on measurements of a few skeletal bones which were usually fragmentary and often poorly preserved. The measurements did not describe the complex shape of some bones and did not distinguish between aspects which are important for understanding locomotion from those which were not. Finally, there is an overwhelming body of evidence based on the work of nearly 30 scientists which contradict Oxnard's work. These studies use a variety of techniques, including those used by Oxnard, and were based on many different body parts and joint complexes. They overwhelmingly indicate that Australopithecines resemble humans more closely than the living apes.
Fossils that are included by evolutionists under imaginary classifications, such as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, or Homo sapien archaic, in fact belong to different human races.
He is not providing any evidence that these fossil skulls represent other races of humans. Keep in mind, creationists often are at odds with one another when determining that particular skulls belong to a human or a modern ape. Homo erectus shows clear morphological distinctions from Homo sapiens.
Famous evolutionist paleontologist Richard Leakey admits that the difference between the skulls classified as Homo erectus and those of modern men is only racial. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans.
Here we have a quote mine. Leakey was probably referring to the fact that with every species we will see variation. Just like we see variation among cats, among dogs, we see it among Homo sapiens and among Homo erectus.
The only defense left to evolutionists against all these scientific facts is just one thing: propaganda.
This is a deliberate straw man and projection. The speaker provided absolutely no evidence for creationism and was only attacking areas of evolution that he does not understand. If anything, creationism is propaganda.
The baseless scenario of the human evolution is imposed on the public by means of imaginary drawings that appear in evolutionist publications. In these drawings, creatures with hairy bodies and simian features are decked out with overtones of human-like motifs. The given impression is that these half-man, half-ape transitional forms did live once. From time to time, drawings that present snapshots from the social life of these creatures are made. These misleading drawings are introduced in a particular sequence to engrave the scenario of the human evolution on the subconscious of society. Even in the most famous scientific publications, there frequently appear such window dressings called reconstructions and imaginary family tree drawings made by their inspiration. The imaginative power of evolutionists is not limited to fictional drawings and models. They go even further and shoot movies in which imaginary half-man, half-ape creatures act. However, all of these are pure deception. The only evidence at hand is generally nothing more than a few skull fragments.
Just because there are artists who paint pictures and make sculptures of what the past may have looked like does not mean evolution is wrong. Scientists do not use drawings or any kind of artwork to prove evolution. The mountains of evidence that they find does a very good job at this. The reason why his argument is fallacious is because I could just as easily paint a picture of Adam and Eve in the garden, and then someone will point out that it's just a fanciful drawing and therefore young Earth creationism is propaganda, which it is, and I don't need a fanciful drawing to prove it.